as we take regulation and implement it into code, laws into code as the structure of autonomous government, at that point, we're going to have to say this regulation doesn't make any sense. This law doesn't make any sense. And so I think that process of creating autonomous government with, AI is going to create much more of a sort of level playing field in that respect. But even that process itself, China, for example, I think would be much better equipped today to make that translation, whereas in the US you have to have a debate about which laws you keep and which laws go, right? And that debate is going to take 20 years? I don't know, right? And so I think that's the point of it, is that in terms of agility, if you're talking about agile operations, in terms of agility, China, I think, has significant advantages over the US as a 21st century economy.
Welcome to the Gold Republic Podcast. My name is Bart Brans.
And I'm Alexei Jordanov. In our weekly podcast, we invite guests from all over the world to get valuable insights
into the emergence of a new monetary system through the lens of precious metals, cryptocurrencies, and other financial instruments.
Welcome to the Gold Republic Podcast. In this interview, we have Brett King. Brett King is an Australian futurist, author, and also co-founder and CEO of Moven. He is New York-based and is also one of the influencers in the financial services industry globally. He has written many books about banking and the future of banking, and we have a pleasure to have him here on our platform today. Brett, welcome.
Thanks, guys.
Brett,
good to be here.
It's good to have you virtually here as well. One of the questions I was asking myself
is that I got my SpaceX shirt on. I'm SpaceX today.
Well, exactly. We can travel time and space across universes. Actually, that's actually one of my first questions: is what drives you? What is your pursuit? What's your quest? Just like Elon Musk is to go on Mars. What is your moonshot?
Look, I think many futurists, what they have in common is, we're in a hurry to get to the future. We're techno-optimists. We believe that technology can solve many of the problems that humanity faces. I am realistic, though, in my assessment that humanity is coming to a critical turning point, with the climate emergency and issues around equality and the potential for AI disrupting employment and our way of life are significant. So you combine all of those, we have a great deal of potential economic uncertainty and social unrest potentially. And so that's, I do think that, there are some challenges that we need to work out philosophically. But as a futurist, what drives me? I want to get to the future. I'd love to live to 300, 400 years, spend some time on Mars and touring the solar system and, doing all that is that all of the potential things that we could do in the 21st century with the advances we're seeing in technology.
If you look at former futurists, because, we've seen predictions since, I guess, the 1950s of us being able to go on a round trip to the moon and Mars by this time. What do you feel is their greatest, maybe, miscalculation when it comes to where we are right now? And could those hurdles that we've seen, those mismanaged predictions, could we perhaps be able to take these into account?
Some of them, look, when we look at some of those predictions in the past, some of them were bang on. Some were off by orders of magnitude in terms of timing, but directionally are there. Obviously, if just look at the series on Apple TV right now, For All Mankind, which shows an alternate timeline where the US and Russian space race continued beyond the Apollo landings, because the Russians landed first in this universe. And you have by the 1980s developments for taking humanity to Mars. And so, we lost the political will for it, and it's been left to private enterprise essentially to do that. Technically, of course, we demonstrated we could get to the moon, back in the 1960s and 1970s, and obviously the technology to do it now, it would be vastly improved. But we haven't had the political will to do it. But if we look at some of the other predictions, look at Isaac Asimov with his discussions about robotics. Look at Arthur C. Clarke, with some of his predictions about the internet, the use of satellite technology, and so forth. Okay, maybe he got 2001. It was a little bit early, the space hotels and space habitats and things like that. But a lot of, what we see in the past, is good inspirational, good fodder for technologists today. Sci-fi is a strong influencer of technologists. Even Elon Musk, he names his ocean drones, the ships or the barges that land the first stage Falcon 9 rockets on them. He names them after starships out of the Ian Banks Culture series, as an example. The Falcon is named after the Millennial Falcon, etc. And so we see, some clear sort of, I guess, just people, their imagination is opened as a result of sci-fi, and then they look at the possibilities. How do we actually get this stuff done? Even the Star Trek communicator and the Motorola flip phone and so forth, right? So
it's actually a great jump into what I had in mind of when you were talking about sci-fi. When we look at sci-fi, and you just mentioned actually already two of the movies I want to discuss, is you have from one side Star Trek and Star Wars. In both of them, when you look at the concept of money itself and the way the monetary system is set up, is totally different from one world to another.
Correct.
Right? In Star Wars, you have the credit base, you have the intergalactic credit bank as well, and in Star Trek, you have more of a karma-like barter social currency type of interaction. Which one of those two, let's say, sci-fi inspired monetary worlds do you actually believe in, and which ones are we on now, and which one would you like to actually move towards?
This is a very fundamental question. You could ask the question, what does money accomplish for humanity? Or even more fundamentally, you could ask the question, what's the purpose of capitalism and the economy itself? If we look at many of the systems that we've created around commerce, they are abstractions. They're arbitrary classifications of value that made sense to create common value exchange in economies that were largely barter based. But the capitalist system itself and commerce itself has created also perverse incentives that have worked against humanity as a species. Conflicts around the world over national boundaries, conflicts over oil in the Middle East. These are abstractions that are necessary theoretically. If you look at the Earthrise photo taken by the Apollo 10 crew when they circled the moon, that first view of the planet from outer space, with no borders, and seeing the beauty of the globe hanging in space, changed people's perception. It started the environmental movement and so forth in great earnest back in the 1970s. And from that came Earth Day and Greenpeace and a whole lot of other initiatives. But the point is, if we look at sort of the philosophy of humanity, what is the purpose of humanity? Aristotle said the purpose of humanity is to thrive as a species, and yet commerce creates these trade-offs that we have in this economic system that are arbitrary creations of this commercial system, and aren't necessarily the most efficient ways for humanity to work together. It has provided a structure for us that has made sense over the last 300-400 years, but ultimately, if you extend that out over another 1,000 years, is it the best system we could possibly have? And that's really the question. Do we continue to have something like a commerce? Do we move to a global digital currency? Is that the way that humanity is going to evolve, or is it going to evolve into something more like the Star Trek system? And it really comes back to scarcity. And so when you think about, commerce is an attempt to manage scarcity in many respects. Whereas if we had, the capability, unlimited energy and unlimited resources, then, the scarcity problem disappears, and you could have a utopian system like Star Trek suggested. It really comes down to how we choose in the future to plan and build society moving forward. Let's take, the big decision we're going to have to make over the next decade or two is how we deal with the impact of artificial intelligence on the way we work. Now, all the models that we've looked at show that about half of the jobs we have today will be made obsolete by artificial intelligence. New jobs will be created, but will be working far less in the future as a result of automation. And so the role that work itself plays in our society may change. But that also means that, we have to take a very different look at, how do people survive if the work isn't there, if they can't work because society's been automated to a level where their work is unnecessary or reduced. And this then raises issues like universal basic income and so forth. But, when you look at the purpose of an economy itself, what is its purpose? Is the purpose to create GDP growth, or is the purpose of an economy to look after the citizens? And if you take that latter view, then at a certain point you say, do we have the resources to make sure that everyone is, healthy, clothed, fed, housed, educated, and have their health taken care of? We do have the resources to do that today. We have the capability to manage those resources so that happens, irrespective of whether or not there's profit attached to that. So it's just a question humanity has to answer: is what sort of direction for the species do we want? Do we want to continue with this sort of organized chaos through negotiation based on capitalism, or can we find a better way to, as an organizing principle for humanity as a species, so that humanity as a species thrives? And that's the inflection point I think we're coming to. And ultimately, I would like to think, as an optimist, as a utopian, that we can design a better way of organizing human systems so that we all benefit. We live longer lives, happier lives, more fulfilled lives, without the need to pursue a 9-to-5 job to pay for putting clothes on our back and food on the table.
Mm. And in that sense, how would you see the role of, because that's also like one of the most focused subjects that you also have been also writing about the last years, is just banking in general. You've also co-founded a neobank, Moven.
Correct.
So when you actually you talked about this when we met first time as well, and I think it was fascinating because it gives perspective on also for the listeners and viewers of what the evolution.
We met at the Moven office, right?
We were at the Moven office in the
at WeWork.
Exactly, at WeWork, and I actually always believe that history can tell us also like the foundational knowledge or building blocks of what we can expect in tomorrow. And in that sense, what are the major evolutionary process that banking has been through until the present day, as a crash course?
So we sort of break it into various phases. So you had, you had currency develop before banking. Now you had credit systems and things like that in the long past, but then you had the sort of informalized banking system. In many ways, it can be argued the Knights Templar were one of the first bankers, because they used to manage the wealth of the wealthy elite in Europe and ship coin across the continent. But it wasn't until, of course, the 13th century that we started to see the emergence of what we would call the banking system today, initially through like the Medici Bank. You read The Merchant of Venice from Shakespeare, and you have the early foundations of the financiers that used to operate as part of the commerce system back then. They were more involved in lending and offering credit and things like that, rather than banking in the way we consider it today. But this is where we got the term bankers, because those merchants would sit on the marble benches in the marketplaces in Siena and Verona and Firenze, and the marble bench is called the banco, right? And so they became the bench sitters, the bancos. That's where they sit to do their money changing activities. But the Medici Bank certainly was the first formal bank, the Medici Bank sort of collapsed around the time, not long after Cosimo Medici passed away. But by then, of course, this pattern, became a useful template. So you have Monte dei Paschi di Siena, the oldest bank in the world, that was about a decade after Cosimo Medici's death when they were founded, and they still exist today. So, we have those roots. There's other elements. The mortgage, this came as a legal structure out of the UK. So Thomas Littleton was really core to that in the 12th century. And it was the term that he used in Latin was vadium mortem, the dead pledge. You translate that into French, you get mortgage, so you get mortgage. Right, mort being death, gage being a pledge or commitment, and it was essentially a legal commitment by the person purchasing the land to pay for that land over a period of time, and we still use that same basic structure today. Where it got different was that as these banks started to build up and as global communications and travel was created, you started to have banks that wanted to look to leverage that sort of global positioning. So then you move in from the early formalized banking system to universal banking. And so this was really a sort of 18th, 19th century structure, maybe Lloyd's of London with insurance and some of the bigger banks, early in the 19th century and then in the 20th century becoming sort of these globally recognized brands. And they, attempted to become these sort of full service, financial service places where you could go for all of your financial needs. And then, of course, we shift into omni-channel, multi-channel banking as a result of the improvement in self-service technology. This sort of started with technology application of banking in the 1950s, the first bank mainframes. That's where we get bank account numbers from. We never had bank account numbers before mainframes were introduced. We couldn't sort customer records by their names and addresses, which is the way we used to keep records of bank accounts in the old days prior to computers. We had to give each customer a unique sort code so the computers could sort them. That became the bank account number. And then, you have ATM and call center telephone banking and eventually internet banking designed to sort of extend on branch operating hours. That sort of created this multi-channel era of banking. And today, we're shifting to this era of what I call embedded or ubiquitous banking, where banking will just be embedded in the world around you through the technology layer, and you'll have access to the utility of the bank without having to physically go to a bank or even potentially work with a bank, because you may work with a super app or a wallet provider that can provide your day-to-day banking needs. In fact, most people don't realize this, but today on a daily basis, mobile wallets get twice the use of plastic debit cards and credit cards globally. And so that's already happening.
What actually then...
It's a brief history of banking.
It is. It's great. I think it's great. And you must be repeating it all the time, but I'm grateful that you did in such a concise way. That actually leads me then to the outlook, because now we see where we came from, and now we might also want to understand what the role of banking also, I think, okay, now I'm kind of off tracking because I'm kind of brain farting, as you would say, but there is basically a mistrust of banks, right? More and more people have a very wrong connotation or perception of banks, and banks are also getting more and more weight. There's a trend of consolidation of banks globally as well. Less and less bank charters from year to year, especially in the United States. So what does it tell us? It tells us that banks are getting increasingly more important, but increasingly more also distrusted. So how does that even basically play out in the future for the system?
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that, there was a while ago when you said in a different interview, being a good bank is not enough in the future. Could you expand on that?
So, if you look at the function that banks have held in society for consumers, but, to some extent for businesses as well, it's, the function's primarily been around three areas, right? The ability to safely store your money, the ability to safely move money, so make payments, send money to other people, and thirdly, the ability to access credit. Now, this is absent the primary function of what a bank provides in the mind of a consumer, which is some form of financial security. The reason I go to a bank right now today is because I know my money is going to be protected. It's better than putting it under my pillow. But having said that, banks really don't help you save money. Banks have been fairly predatory in terms of the way they structured banking, overdraft fees. Just look at a credit card product. What do you see when you look at credit card advertising around the world? You see spend, 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 get these rewards for spending. You get more airline miles, you get more cash back. The more you spend, the more you save, which is actually not true. The more you spend, the more financial difficulty you get into. And so the banking system has been geared towards making money off the products of banking, rather than actually saying what's the best thing a bank can do for a person in their financial lives, which is help them save money, help them get financially healthy. And so that's been absent, the design of banking. And that was, one of the core drivers behind us founding Moven. We wanted to create a smart bank account that helped you save money over time. And we've demonstrated that successfully. In fact, so we work a lot with TD Bank. In Canada, as an example, they use our tech. And so what we've been able to demonstrate at TD Bank, and this is in the public domain, but, the customers that use Moven's technology, the financial wellness technology, they save on average 5 to 8% more month on month than an average customer just using the standard, TD banking app and products. And so just by making people more informed about how they're using their money, helping them make better spending decisions, you get people saving more money. It's not that hard. But that's where I think the distrust comes in is that there's this, you have this, what I call lucky to be a customer scenario as well, where you have to apply to the bank and maybe, if you're not too risky, maybe we'll let you have a banking product. That's been sort of the mindset of bankers and the way it's been structured. And the technology is turning that on its head. When we look at these alternative players coming into mainstream financial services through apps and through startups these days, we're finding much better ways of delivering the utility of banking without the sort of banking ethos that has developed, through the 20th century. And so 21st century banking is going to be very different. I think people are going to select the tools that help them get access to financial services, but also help them sort of manage their money more effectively on a day-to-day basis.
In that sense, when you look at this, I think also a great bridge towards what we see as also the decentralization of finance. So what is called as DeFi, powered by blockchain and cryptocurrencies. Whereas back in the days and until the present day, the creation of money was in the hand not only of central banks, but mainly of actually banks in general. The creation of money is now a few lines of code away, and also with the potential of being decentralized. So now the creation of money goes from institutional to more consumer-driven or network-based structures. Would you say that in one way or another, there could be an increasing clash or friction or even replacement in that trend in the next decades? Is it something realistic or something that still is too early to say?
Well, you've got a lot of different forces coming to bear here. The reason why we see cryptocurrencies and DeFi and decentralized arguments these days is because the world is learning that commerce is global, information is global, content is global. And so it doesn't really make sense to have currencies that are geographically bound. The US dollar or the petrodollar centralization in the global economy, now presents some risks, around the quality of the US dollar when you have so much quantitative easing and things like that, and the likes of China and Russia sort of making alternative moves to move away from that, either using the euro as an alternative trading currency, or as you see with China now with the digital yuan, which is not at this point designed specifically to disrupt US dollar trade, but could have that effect if it gains popularity, as an example. But that's an interesting point, is that China has created their CBDC. It's now going through trials in 8 different cities. They've just announced that they're going to extend the trials to Hong Kong and Singapore, potentially other international centers as well. Certainly, it has been successful in places like Shenzhen and elsewhere. And the one thing that the CBDCs have had the ability to do on an accelerated basis that cryptocurrencies like Tether, Ethereum, Bitcoin, etc. haven't, is that they've been able to sort of force circulation rapidly and encourage usage. And so if you want to look at the success story of how Alipay and Tencent WeChat Pay became so massive in China in just the space of a few years, taking cash use from 98% of retail commerce transactions down to under 40% in just the space of 6 years, the key to that was people spending it. And, when we look at Bitcoin, you could argue that Bitcoin's design flaw was the 21 million Bitcoin limit, and that created an inflationary effect that led to hodling and speculation on the currency rather than people spending it. Whereas with, you look at Ant Financial and Tencent WeChat Pay, when they launched around like the Chinese New Year red packets, the LIC, giving people digital red packets. And so once people had a gift of money and they had money sitting in a mobile wallet, what are they going to do with it? They're going to spend it. And so that created that momentum behind those mobile wallet structures. And so the CBDC in China have very effectively used that same type of methodology to get CBDC adoption in China ramping up quite quickly. And so if you look at the decentralized issue of currencies, that's great for transportability and equality and, an ability for the market to set a level of the value of the currency in a way that fiat currencies, cannot yet do. But they have the distribution issue. How do you get people using that cryptocurrency? And that's where the fiat cryptos may actually have an advantage. Having said that, it doesn't look like the US is really interested as yet. They're looking at it, but I think this is where China is going to show some. They're going to have an advantage here, a strong advantage here, because of their experimentation with this over the last couple of years.
How do you relate to recently Peter Thiel claiming that Bitcoin was actually a weapon against the US dollar, saying that China and also other countries like Russia were leveraging Bitcoin as potentially a weapon to destabilize and devalue even more the US dollar?
Well, I mean, anything that competes with the US dollar could be described as a weapon that is trying to reduce the power of the US dollar. The reality is that the fact that the US is sort of the reserve currency for the world, has with it some risks. And moving away from that, Americans will see that as a sort of existential threat to the power of the US economy, when the reality is, well, why should the US dollar be the world's reserve currency? The move away from the gold standard and Bretton Woods and all of that, you could argue that was an attempt by the US to ensure that the US dollar would have primacy and become a sort of a control currency of the world. But the US is not going to be the largest economy in the world within the space of a few years. And so why should the US, as the world's second and then third and then fourth largest economy, why should it dictate the world's reserve currency? It really doesn't make a lot of sense. So is Bitcoin a threat to the US dollar in the same way as the euro is a threat to the US dollar, I guess? But was it designed in that way? I don't think so. Obviously we can debate who Satoshi was, and what his or their motivations were, because there's some constructs where Satoshi was actually made up of different people. But the reality is, when it was designed, it was initially designed as a way just to create digital value exchange and a more decentralized, more efficient mechanism for an economy built on the internet. Or a world global economy built on the internet. It wasn't designed for the purpose of attacking the US dollar. I think that's a very American view. Even though I live in the States, I don't hold that view.
When it comes to the dollar, a while ago you had an interview and you said that when it comes to the corona pandemic, we are trying to manage this crisis, this 21st century crisis, with the 19th and 20th century tools. Yeah, you explicitly talked about stimulus packages. Well, then you talk about the United States, of course, when people still get checks mailed to them, physical checks mailed to them. I would love to hear you talk about that a little bit more. Also, because it might just be that the dollar is putting itself out of business because it doesn't want to innovate and move along with, for example, the Chinese CBDC innovations and developments.
Look, just as you see various industries that are challenged by innovation, so we've seen obviously massive disruption of industries by the internet writ large. Amazon's success, Netflix, Blockbuster, Borders, you name it. We can go through any range of industries. It's happening in medical industry right now with technology. That health tech is disrupting the medical sector. It's happening in finance, obviously. But it does happen with governments as well. We have seen in the past the British Empire was disrupted, and the Roman Empire was disrupted. And much of the reason that these systems fade away is that they don't adapt to changing behavior and changing conditions. In the United States as a government, or as a system, has a lot of gross inefficiencies in it. The healthcare system, which Americans celebrate as a free market system, is one of the worst performing bang for buck. In fact, it is the worst performing bang for buck healthcare system in the OECD world, right? And so, when you look at that, it screams for innovation. But then you say, well, this has been obvious for the last 20 years, why hasn't there been serious attempts at fixing it? And there have, but the vested interests, that are resistant to that change, are the ones that have the ability to write laws. The corporations, the big pharma companies and so forth, these are the guys who are sponsoring bills, with politicians and ensuring that their system is not threatened by these innovations or changes. The same in the banking sector. The US is probably now 7 to 10 years behind China when it comes to fintech innovation. Part of that is that the regulators have taken a very, firm view. The US is one of very few developed economies that don't have a fintech banking charter, as an example. You have to get a normal banking charter. And the reason for that is that there are various laws in place, such as the Community Reinvestment Act from the 1970s, which dictate that branches are the best mechanism for financial inclusion of the US population, getting access to credit. And that's a law that was put in place in the 1970s. Now restate that, financial inclusion can occur digitally, you have to remove that law and come up with a better way. But the banks who have had to pay for all this real estate infrastructure to support that law for 50 years are saying, it's an uneven playing field. These digital competitors don't have to comply with these regulations that are already in place. And so in doing so, by making you have to comply with laws that were written in the 1970s or even earlier, you now have a situation where that innovation is just coming up against the status quo. Whereas China dealt with it in a much more free market methodology, if you like. They let Ant and Alipay and all these guys just go for it. And now that the disruption in the industry has sort of really, rocked the Chinese banking and finance sector, they've now come in and said to Alipay and Tencent that they need to organize as a bank holding company and come under that structure. So two very different regulatory approaches. The US's resistance to change is partially because of those vested interests, but partially because the US can't conceptualize that their system isn't the best system in the world. And so, the basis of innovation is recognizing that you have a problem that can be fixed through technology. And that's where we're challenged in terms of sort of the US policy setting and so forth. There are obviously those in the US that argue for this quite strongly and vehemently, but the system itself doesn't allow the rate of change that's required. So ultimately, I think if you look at the US, just on the single basis of infrastructure, China is spending 3 to 4 times annually what the US government is spending on infrastructure. They built the Belt and Road Initiative globally, based on sort of building 21st century interoperable infrastructure across, over national boundaries, cross-border, and built on, strong information technology companies that are growing and starting to dominate the world. It's no coincidence that Huawei was attacked by the US security infrastructure. Part of that was just Huawei's continuing success and lead in the 5G technology area. And so ultimately, China is building a 21st century capable economy. They're training their kids at grade school on artificial intelligence. They've got, more MBAs studying, or more PhD candidates in the STEM fields than the entire, student population of the United States. So they're going to have naturally an advantage when it comes to sort of setting the standard for a 21st century economy. And that's, the US is still stuck very much in that mindset of it worked in the 20th century, it can work now, but the reality is it's a very different world.
Not only that, but I just wanted to say I find it really fascinating that you just said that free market operation is better, and I share the same position in when I just observation is that there are more possibilities of free market operation in China, in a communist dictatorship, than in the so-called free United States, and where you see that these vested interests really are embedded so deeply into the political system that it doesn't make any innovation, or it really draws back or holds on to the capability, the innovation capability of the country, and, for example, the banking system. So, yeah, it's a beautiful observation.
I mean, I can give you hard stats on this, but about 80% of the patents issued in the United States include a foreign-born specialist or inventor. You look at the scientific infrastructure of the United States, it's dominated by H-1B visa recipients, and so when you look at Trump during his administration reducing H-1B visas, it's like America shooting themselves in the foot, because they don't have free STEM education. They have lower STEM input on a percentage basis in terms of students studying STEM programs in the United States that are U.S. citizens. The dominant STEM students in the United States are foreign citizens coming to learn at U.S. universities, and so. They don't have a respect for the role that technology is going to play in the future of their economy, at least absent Silicon Valley. So they sort of rely on Silicon Valley to do all that stuff rather than, make it a point of policy and core infrastructure for the economy, which is, I think, ultimately one of the reasons why the US is no longer going to be the world's number one economy within a fairly short order. And so, the question comes, how would you restructure US society, or the US economy if you wanted to lead again? Well, you'd start with free education, focusing education on technology skills. You'd reduce the defense spending to invest in infrastructure, including revisions to education and the healthcare system. The US has about 2 million homeless people right now, 17 million vacant homes. There's so many contradictions in terms of the US system that sort of when you really look at it, you can see the flaws. The US, though, has some of the brightest minds in the business and does have mechanisms for creating incredible, advancements in technologies. And, they've demonstrated that since the 1940s and 1950s. The real question is whether or not the US can sort of get out of its own way. Where China, really has an advantage in this respect is that they don't have a policy debate. When President Xi and the party decide that they're going to modernize the economy, they don't have to argue between the Republicans and Democrats and get an agreement or consensus on this. They can just advance those policy changes, and as a result, it's more efficient. Now, I'm not arguing for a autocratic style of government like China necessarily, but having said that, in the environment we're in, where there's rapid change required because of the level of innovation that's being thrust on society, that sort of system is better at absorbing change than the system that the US has. It's quite an interesting conundrum.
Just to expand on that, because if it's okay with you, I wanted to challenge you a bit on that.
Please.
Isn't it that China doesn't have the regulation, where in the United States there are these mountains of regulations where all these companies have to conform to, where in China there is, maybe because it is a one-party system, there is just basic rules. And within these rules, there are a lot of places where you can maneuver into free market situations. For example, if you just want to start a restaurant, you just start it in your house. Where in the United States, because of vested interests, there are all these rules created by both parties. And of course, there's a debate, but in China, there just is no rule, and therefore free markets can just thrive more than they can now in the United States.
Obviously, there's a point at which in China, when you have a lack of regulation or a lack of intervention, there's a point where that hurts, the Chinese citizens, and where eventually, the Chinese government will do the right thing. Pollution in Beijing is an example of that, right? For a long time, in Beijing, the official, particulate matter, pollution figures were much lower than actual. What really sort of blew that up was Twitter launching in China, and the U.S. Embassy had a air quality station on the top of the embassy and was reporting those figures every day. And the Chinese government argued for a long time that that was false information. But when you couldn't see the sky because of the pollution, and you have so many people dying from pollution-related deaths, it becomes clear that there is actually a real problem. And so this is part of the shift and when they made the decision to change that, then China moved quite rapidly. They shut down factories. They have started obviously closing coal plants and moving to more renewable energy sources and things like that. So they have shown that potential. Same when they've had like fake food. Quality issues, like the infant milk issues and things like that. They have come in and put regulation in place. Here's where it gets really interesting. Regulation, as it stands, is a lot of laws that we have on the books, and a lot of the regulations we have from earlier times, that have survived for 100 or 200 years, are not necessarily efficient anymore or applicable, but they're sort of still stuck on the legal books, and we still have legal process attached to it. Where it gets really interesting is that as we move to autonomous government, we're going to have to encode that regulation in law. And at that point in time, I think there's going to be a sort of a sea change. I think as we take regulation and implement it into code, laws into code as the structure of autonomous government, at that point, we're going to have to say this regulation doesn't make any sense. This law doesn't make any sense. And so I think that process of creating autonomous government with AI is going to create much more of a sort of level playing field in that respect. But even that process itself, China, for example, I think would be much better equipped today to make that translation, whereas in the US, you have to have a debate about which laws you keep and which laws go, right? And that debate is going to take, 20 years? I don't know, right? And so I think that's the point of it, is that in terms of agility, if you're talking about agile operations, in terms of agility, China, I think, has significant advantages over the US as a 21st century economy.
That actually makes me want to just kind of ramble on the possibility of having an artificially intelligence-driven monetary system. We've seen already that banking is basically riddled through Wall Street and optimization of microseconds of tradings and all that, and efficiencies and speed, and executing small trades, but high-frequency trading. Can we say that in some way, of course, depending on the political realm, that we have the emergence of different AIs clashing to each other, optimizing economies, but using the global financial system as their playing field?
I'm going to blow your mind right now. And let me lay it out for you like this. So I'm wearing my SpaceX T-shirt, so I'm going to give Elon a shout out, right? So Elon Musk is trying to make mankind a multiplanetary species. Let's just assume that he has some success of that by 2050 we have, I don't know, 500,000, 1 million people on a Mars base Alpha, living in the first city on Mars. What does the Martian economy look like?
Well, who owns the Martian economy in the first place? That's the question.
It's going to be based on AI, obviously. And what does commerce? What does the model look like? Well, let's sort of step back from it. What would be the goal of the Martian economy? The primary goal, and Musk has stated it repeatedly, is the primary goal will be self-sustainability. the ability for them not to be reliant on spaceships, starships coming from Earth to resupply Mars. And so that's the primary goal of the economy. So let's call it a sustainable prosperity doctrine. That is, everyone will do well on Mars if we work together to make it sustainable. So what sort of policy or what sort of approach does that make for people living on Mars as colonists? Well, obviously you want to use as little energy as possible. You want to put more energy and more product or more resources back into the system as possible, because that gets you to self-sustainability as quickly as possible. And so if you look at the Mars trilogy written by Kim Stanley Robinson, who's also written a very good book on dealing with climate change on Earth, for example, called The Ministry of the Future. But if you look at his Mars trilogy, he proposes an economy based on what he calls eco-poetics, whereas assets are actually the net energy you put back into the system. That's how we would value assets. So let's imagine that your primary currency on Mars now is a cryptocurrency that is geared towards low energy usage and low resource usage, and that you actually accumulate credit when you put more energy back in the system than you take out of it. When you grow more food than you eat, when you produce more oxygen than you breathe, right? And so imagine an economy with a cryptocurrency like that as the basis for it. What sort of commerce takes place in that sort of economy? Suddenly you have an economy working very differently in terms of sustainability and, as a collective group working for this purpose. You step back from that and you sort of say, well, why don't we do that already on Earth? Why do we have this situation where we're just like converting resources, raping the planet of all these resources without consequence, and look at where it's got us? Is that system that we've got today working for humanity? It's not working for the planet. And so this really raises a really interesting question, is that, what if we could design money to change the trajectory of the species? And that's what cryptocurrency can do. The US dollar can't do that, And so, what if we put different levers, what if we created different tokens or different cryptocurrencies where the levers were, sustainability, reusability, recyclability, all of those sort of things that are built into and the more that you just used a resource and converted it, the less your wealth would grow. It could be a really interesting concept.
Definitely, and I think in general you could see as well that a lot of technologies that we had also here on a spaceship Earth actually were born out of the desire to improve things like the microwave or even mattresses from space technology. And so by going outer, we also maybe are able to come closer from within and solve the things that we have in front of us, and also a practice that thought of scarcity, because I personally don't want to live on Mars. as much as it sounds like a great sci-fi, I like it here. But either way, on another note, when we scale a bit down the perspective, we see also that banking is also something that companies themselves, like mega corporates that are state level from influence and in terms of cash flow and everything else. I think Apple has almost more cash reserved than federal government in some manners.
Yeah, more than 70 nations. Yeah, so one of the terms that sort of has come up through popular literature is transnational corporations.
Yes,
and these transnational corporations, essentially are more powerful than many governments. Certainly, smaller Pacific Island governments and things like that.
And that brings me then to the point of companies, corporations like Facebook creating their own currencies and de facto also being their own, not even bank, but monetary system, but privately owned, and in conjunction with private owned data. And that's my next point, is basically surveillance capitalism that basically enacts from these kind of structures emerging, and where governments seem to be only able to react instead of acting, right? Just saying blocking through regulations or by getting themselves together and say, well, we're going to block those initiatives. But there is basically, in one way or another, a fight or a change in the system that makes then the public good less important, and where infrastructure is being left upon the basically the void that's been filled by those private enterprises, and that if we follow that trend, go into fascism in a way, corporatism, fascism in a way, where it's not the state going into...
it's probably more neo-feudalism.
Yes.
Corporate neo-feudalism, right? Where we're economically enslaved to these corporations. There's a very interesting argument. You look at the billionaires on the planet accumulated $10 trillion of wealth during the pandemic. And there's a very good question as to whether that was appropriate. Now, the trillionaires and billionaires rather, are fine with that. Future trillionaires potentially, but there's a very good question there as to whether or not that is a efficient resource allocation method. And the same goes for companies like Apple and Facebook, with Apple in particular, with over $200 billion of cash reserves. Is that efficient for them to have that huge amount of cash reserves? Why isn't that spent on digital inclusion, for example, on the planet? We have the tools. Starlink is proving right now we have the capability to solve that. Why couldn't there be more social good done with that cash instead of it sitting in Apple's bank account? So, there is a very real question as to, these these ecosystems that these companies create. Now, within those ecosystems, if you're a Google employee, for example, you're doing pretty well. You get paid pretty well. You get free food at the Google campus when it's open. You get free healthcare. You get free gym memberships. You get free transportation. So they've created this sort of socialist utopia within the corporation in many respects. But, you have to be a part of that club to get in there. And so, there are very real sort of conflicts when it comes to value systems when these corporations get very, very large, as to whether or not that is an efficient mechanism, for the economy at large and for citizens at large that have generally paid for those corporations to grow. I think that's a question we've been asking for a long time. When you look at the most successful economies in history, and Will Durant did this in his book Lessons of History back in the 1960s, it became very, very clear that most of human history had been governed by sort of a pyramid-shaped economic system, which is the wealthy elite controlled the governance, and the wealth was designed to flow uphill. That they were the feudal systems of old, the monarchies and so forth. So what made the U.S. economy after the Second World War very different is it became this diamond-shaped economy. And why it was diamond-shaped is the wealth distribution, the bell curve of wealth distribution was very evenly distributed throughout the economy. Now, this, even distribution of wealth created incredible growth in the economy, consumption growth, housing booms, infrastructure investment and everything they put back into creating jobs for returning servicemen and so forth. That added fuel to the economic fire. And, this was why the US economy was the most successful economy in history, because it was diamond-shaped. But in the 1970s, the Reagan government and the Thatcher government started attacking trade unions and collective bargaining agreements. And then in the 1980s, we had the deregulation of the financial services system by Clinton. And both of those moves flattened the bell curve, shifted the bell curve to the right, so you had less wealth distribution to the lower to middle income households and more wealth going back to the rich. And so you go from a diamond back to a pyramid-shaped economy. And that's why today in the United States, you have the worst inequality in the history of the United States. And so, and you could say it's been a legislated redistribution of wealth from the poor to the rich. And the way the corporations fit in that system is definitely part of that system because, the market, the stock market, has provided all of this growth during the pandemic, but that's been only accessible to a very small section of the US population. So the best economies in terms of growth and happiness, freedom, all of those things are economies with robust equality and broad wealth distribution, and that's not what the U.S. economy is today. What will it take to get back to that? It would take one of two things: either legislated redistribution of wealth back down the economic value chain, or revolution. And if you look at the world over the last 20 years. Look at the protests that have been happening around the world. Since if you take, say, the last 50 years of the 20th century, and you look at each decade there, even including the civil rights movements and the anti-Vietnam protests during the 70s and so forth, and then you take the first 20 years of the 21st century, we have more than 200% increase in the number of protests around the world. But the really interesting stat is we have 1,000% increase in the participation of citizens involved in protests against the system. And so if you look at that rapid increase of the protest movement globally, based on things like inequality, inaction against climate change, and so forth, and you combine it with the shift from a diamond-shaped economy to a pyramid-shaped economy, you get a fairly tight correlation that the protests are because of economic uncertainty. And economic uncertainty is because of lack of equality.
Great, fantastic. It also reminds me because you had you mentioned just the revolution part, and it makes me think of the Henry Ford quote that goes that if people of a nation do not understand the banking and monetary system, for if they would actually have a revolution before tomorrow morning. And that is kind of like also the key, and also the reason why Bart and I love inviting guests like you to kind of get more understanding of the monetary system, is that the power structures that basically govern them are highly either exclusive, elitist, and even in some way secretive, or made complex and complicated, even though there is no actual reason
so the
behind
average
it.
person can't understand
exactly
it.
and that's I think opaque, exactly, and that's I think the core. If you look at a bit also what Buckminster Fuller also in his ideas and structure as an engineer and architect looked at the way we structure societies, is that maybe in some ways we in the financial system have basically a self-reinforced bias towards complexified jargon. The way we basically, jargon is actually, it's a euphemism now what I'm saying, because the word itself is already something you're supposed to know what it means. But basically a certain set of vocabulary defining simple processes. Quantitative easing, printing money, putting money to the economy.
Yeah.
Stuff
Why
like
don't you
that.
say printing money?
Exactly.
That has a negative connotation.
Yeah, and that's the whole thing, is that
and people understand what it means, so they revolt against the philosophical idea of printing money, but they don't know what quantitative easing is, or it's
philosophically. This is very interesting conversation. If you look at Plato and Socrates, obviously being philosophers, they argued that participation in democracy required a minimum of education. And Jefferson actually agreed with this and felt education should be free for that purpose. To be a good futurist, you have to understand the past. And this is really, when we've seen education levels decline, the ability for people to understand the system because of that opacity, and that complexity is a real problem. And so I think part of that shift is when AI starts to automate government, and we commit to sort of getting rid of these biases. We commit to getting rid of inequality in the system, then I think we can design a better system. But it is going to require that intent. And the problem with that intent is it has to be led from the ground up. It has to be a groundswell movement that we demand this standard, rather than letting the political elite and the financial elite define these systems that the rest of us sit within. Recognizing that I probably straddle both of those worlds, the world of the common man and the financial elite to some extent.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, Brett King, for joining us in this Gold Republic podcast. Really happy to have been able to talk to you. To the viewers of the YouTube channel, of course, if you like this episode of the YouTube of the Gold Republic podcast, feel free to like it. If you have any questions, comments, below in the comment sections. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please do.
And if you're listening this podcast on Spotify or Apple or any other podcast platform, please leave us a review. It helps us to reach more people. Thank you, Brett. Hope to see you soon.
No problem. Watch out for the new book. It's coming out in October. It's called The Rise of Techno-Socialism. It talks about a lot of the stuff we've talked about today. So.
Perfect.
Wow.
Synthesizing all of that in a book. So you've heard it from Brett. He has a new book coming in. And also, don't forget to check out all of the previous books that Brett has written, and even some of them being on the shelf of Xi Jinping himself, isn't it?
Correct. Augmented Life in the Smart Lane. And then, Bank 4.0 is my more recent one. But, feel free to check them out. Thanks for the opportunity, guys.
Thanks, Brett.
Thank you.
Take care and see you next time.